They are thinking about inspiration, changing people's lives. They're
Right.
thinking about how to turn people on about different ideas. So when I say you get lifetime friends, you get to work with people like that. They're not going to be rich. They are, they believe in what they do. And so to me, that is one of the greatest rewards of what I do. And knowing that it makes a difference on society, that these projects, they're not like just doing a housing development. They change the community.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Nakoto Building Arts. I'm your host, Nakoto, and today I'd like to welcome another awesome guest to the podcast, Marcy Goodwin. Marcy is the founder and president of Goodwin Museum Planning, or MGMP, a national leader in consulting services for museums and cultural nonprofits. Marcy's career as a museum planning consultant developed from her experience in four disciplines: museum administration, site selection and development programs, building project management, and exhibition design. She's developed strategic, operational, space, and administrative programs for arts and cultural institutions throughout the United States in an independent consulting practice, directing building programs for the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, the Museum of Modern Art, San Francisco, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Andy Warhol Museum, Pittsburgh, and the Tech Museum of Innovation in San Jose. Ms. Goodwin is an authority on museum practice, museum facility design, and art installations. She has developed over 150 space program plans, feasibility studies, strategic plans, operating plans, and other planning efforts for institutions that in the United States, Asia, and Europe. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Marcy Goodwin to the podcast. How are you today, Marcy?
I'm fine, Nakoto. Nice to see you again. Thank
It is
you.
it is great to see you again and great to talk with you. And I'm so glad you were able to join me today. The first time I saw you was I think it was Washington, D.C., when I saw you presenting at one of the museum conferences. And I said, I need to meet her. But I wasn't able to meet you at the conference, but I was able to get your number and gave you a call. And I can remember to this day, I called you and he was like, "Hello, who's this?" I said, This is Dakota. I'm in a meeting. I'll call you right back." And then you hung up. And then I don't know, a few days, but you did call me back. And it was just a pleasure to speak with you. And it's always a joy to speak with you. Subsequently, was able to work with you on a project. And I love your straightforward and honest dialogue and how you go about how you address issues. And it's just straightforward and it's down to earth and everybody can easily understand it. So it's always a pleasure to speak with you today. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me. So I just want to get into this. Museums play such a vital role in our community today. They help us learn about our past, learn about other cultures, allow us to explore and research, and inspire us for the future. You play such a vital role over the last 40 plus years in this industry as one of the key founding figures in helping organize and create these facilities. So over this conversation, I like to draw on your experience and help and allow you to provide some insight into your process and how you do things and what you've learned along the way. But first, before we get into that, I like to find out more about yourself and about your background and how you even started in this whole journey.
Yes, I'm kind of like born as a museum kid.
Oh, awesome.
And so my family, especially my father, was a design nut, and he was totally into contemporary design and contemporary furniture design and so on. And he was also into museums. My mother was into museums. And
Oh,
so uh, when I was a kid, every month the family would go to visit a museum in San Diego. I grew up in San Diego and had a lot of museums.
oh,
And it was sort of like museums are great educational places. They're great places for families. They're great places for shared experiences. We did it all. And mostly we went to the art museum in La Jolla, which is now called the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego. It was called the Art Center in La Jolla. And
mm,
then we also went to the Fine Arts Museum in Balboa Park.
mm.
And so from birth on, I was taken to these places, and
Oh,
it was just my sister and I talked about it a lot. It was a core part of our growing up. And then from age 8 to about 16, I was able to experience the best in museum education programs. And I really loved it. My parents, they dragged me out to La Jolla all the time. They dragged me downtown to the Museum of Fine Art. And I got to experience direct classes with some of the best artists alive.
mm,
And I loved it. And it was so for me, museums are part of my core identity. And that is an important feature. And when I was a teenager, uh, I was able to be in, for example, a class in La Jolla with Henry Moore, who was a visiting artist in La Jolla, the artist Henry Moore, the sculptor.
yeah. Mhm.
And the rest of the students were all college students from the Midwest, and they decided to scram. They just left. And
Mm.
I was the only student with Henry Moore for 8 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And so we would go out and walk around La Jolla, and he would talk to me. And his lessons on design were very important.
Mm,
I also was very fortunate to be in John Baldessari's class, and John Baldessari passed away recently, but he was one of Southern California's greatest artists. He was
mm,
international in terms of his fame. And John, both of them kind of adopted me. I liked
mm,
being adopted, and they
mm.
took care of me. And it was John Baldessari who, when I asked him where I should go to school, go to college, he said, "You've got a great portfolio. You could go to my college. I'll get you in and I'll make sure you're fine." And he
Mm.
did. And I went to a college called Chenard Art Institute, and it
Mm.
had been where Walt Disney got most of his illustrators for his animation.
Okay.
And as part of that, I met Walt Disney several times,
Oh,
spent time
awesome.
with him. I got free jobs at Disneyland and so on from Walt Disney. And
Wow. Wow.
so I was able to do this. And at the same time, while I was in school, I needed money to live. I had a full scholarship, but a friend was teaching at the Pasadena Art Museum in the education program, and he said, "I'm going to leave, but I need a replacement. Would you like to do this?" I think it was 19. And so I said, "Sure." Paid really well. I knew everything about what to do. And I
Mhm.
got to be a teacher in the same kind of programs I experienced as a kid.
Oh, okay.
And that
Yeah.
the
Well,
Pasadena Art Museum was then very avant-garde. And at the time, they had a Marcel Duchamp show that was very famous. The photograph of Marcel Duchamp playing chess with the naked woman. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
I haven't seen that
I have to
one.
send that to you. It's very cool. So
Yeah.
I was there for all that. And at the time, the Pasadena Art Museum was the hippest of the hip.
Mm.
Then they got a new building, and that was a very informative experience for my long-term museum planning practice. They built a new building designed by these two local architects in Pasadena. The donor had given them part of the money, but they didn't have the rest of the money to build the building, but they built it.
Hmm.
And they had not included operating costs or anything.
Hmm.
And then I worked there and, of course, experienced direct contact with these major people like Richard Serra, who passed away recently, and Robert Rauschenberg, and all of them, Mark DeSuvero. I got to work with all of these artists, which was quite amazing for me, who was then 19, 20, 21.
Right.
It was quite amazing. And also knowing these artists, you know a lot about what they expect for their artwork and how they expect it to be perceived and experienced, because experienced is a vital word for any art installation.
Mm-hmm.
You don't just look at it, you experience it.
Right.
And then I was very fortunate. And then I went to graduate school. And while I was and so my career didn't have a plan.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what I was going to do. I sort of found things that I liked to do, and then people rewarded me. And then I joke that there were a lot of phone calls. People called me out of the blue. And so while I was in graduate school, this woman that I used to sit next to in my art history class, she said, I run this art center, and it's where the Junior Art Center is in Barnstall Park, where the Frank Lloyd Wright Hollyhock House is.
Mm-hmm.
And would you like to be the deputy director? And I sort of said, huh, sure. And I think I was like 21 or so.
Mm-hmm.
And I was quite excited about that. And so I went over to the Junior Art Center because the Pasadena Art Museum was going out of business. And shortly after, Norton Simon took it over. And now that building is the Norton Simon Museum.
Okay.
And so it's doing very well now. And then at the Junior Art Center, I had huge freedom, and I was very good at writing grant proposals, and I could do whatever I wanted. There was a gallery about 1,500 square feet. I had staff that would install any show I wanted, and I just had to write grants that would get us money for these projects. And one grant was very, very successful, and it was for a show called 50 Inches Off the Ground in LA, about how children see their neighborhood. We chose 6 neighborhoods in LA that were geographically diverse and economically diverse, culturally diverse. And then all the kids and I worked in the schools and had 2 or 3 artists from the Junior Art Center that were teachers work with me to teach the 5th graders. And that was a huge success. It went national in terms of the press and so on. And the National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, did a movie about it. And while they were making the movie, the filmmaker said, you know, you would be a natural at this. And I said, what's this? I had no idea what he was talking about. And he said, museum project management. And it had never occurred to me that there was such a profession. I had never heard of such a thing. Even though I did it every day,
Right.
it didn't seem like you could get paid to do such a thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And at that time, it was not a profession. Now it's more of a profession.
Right.
And so it turned out that this man, Glenn Fleck, had a company called Picture Design Group. And then we worked on 2 major projects, one in Iran, to create a major cultural history center for the Shah of Iran. And you know where that went.
Yeah.
In 1978, 79.
Didn't work out.
Didn't work out. The Shah he left town, and so along with the funding for the project,
Mm,
and so we also worked on a project of it. I did an economics museum for the California Science Center in Exposition Park in Los Angeles. And
mm.
that existed for about 15, 20 years, and that was
Oh,
fun. And then I did not like working for this man, and so I quit. And I was wondering, what am I going to do?
mhm.
What could I do? And out of the blue, that day, the phone rang, and this man's voice said, "Marcy, this is Charles Eames." And I said, "Come on," because I thought, because I had grown up with Eames Furniture and Herman Miller and
Mhm.
Noel and all of this, I thought it was one of my friends putting me on.
Franklin.
I thought, there's no way Charles Eames is going to call me. And of course, I knew exactly who he was because of the
Wow.
home I grew up in. And it was Charles. And he offered me a job. And I was like 26, 27. And I got to work at the Eames office with Charles Eames. And that to me was a career start. That was the most remarkable opportunity I could ever have imagined. If I had been a dancer who wanted to be on
Mhm.
Broadway, it
Right.
would be like being offered the star position in a
Right.
new Broadway production.
Wow.
And so I learned so much at the Eames office. It was beyond a graduate school. It was
Mhm.
quite remarkable. And Charles was amazing. And it the people we worked with, I worked with all these amazing world famous designers. And the most interesting was Edward Larrabee Barnes.
Mhm.
I was in charge of an exhibit for the IBM 590 Madison Center that Ed Barnes was designing.
Mhm. Yeah.
And he's certainly one of the favorite people I've ever worked with. He was, I can only call him cool dude, which you would not have expected from the rectilinear purity of his work.
Wow.
And so I must say I appreciate having worked with him. And then after that, after when the Eames office, we were going along and IBM was our client for this exhibit. And I must say I was given huge opportunity to do the things I thought right for the exhibit. And I got
Mhm.
to meet people from around the world. I got to go to various places, including Japan, to
Mhm.
talk about invention, because the one of the key features of IBM at the time, its identity was inventions. That
Mhm.
IBM was then a leader in invention
Mhm.
worldwide. And then Charles died, um, and
Mhm.
so the office closed. And then the phone calls started.
Mhm.
And I worked for IBM on a couple projects. The first computer assisted exhibit in America. I don't know about anywhere else, but for IBM, the computer was about this big, by this
Yeah, it
big,
was.
weighed about 70 pounds. And I worked with IBM's senior technologists, and we
Mhm.
created an interactive exhibit for that went around the country, and it was installed at the California Science Center and in Boston, the
Mhm.
Science Center there, and so on. Then the phone rang again,
Mhm.
and it was Richard Meyer, who
Oh,
was young then,
okay.
and he had gotten his first job doing an art museum. It was in Germany.
Mhm.
And at the time, it was the Museum for Kunsthandwerk, but now it has a name I can't pronounce, Angewandte. But and I worked with him to plan the installations and what the spaces needed to be. Um, Again, like plonked in out of nowhere to do this. And
Hmm.
then the same thing happened, two other phone calls, one in Philadelphia for a project that was starting up about a medical museum. I don't think that ever fully took off. And then one thing after another happened, and I was given these other jobs. I also worked on a major exhibit about the history of Los Angeles for Richard Saul Wurman. The he created the TED Talks and so
Oh,
on,
okay.
but he
Yeah.
was an architect, and he had worked with Lou Kahn and in Philadelphia. And then I also did this guidebook that became the prototype for the rest of his work called LA Access. The Access Guides became a very big deal nationwide. And I did the prototype and created all the standards for it. Then I was very good friends with an artist named Robert Irwin. I think you might have heard of him. And we were very good friends. And then one day he says, well, I'm really good friends with Pontus Hulton and Richard Kashalik, and they're starting this new museum called MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in
Hmm.
Los Angeles. And Bob was on the board of MoCA at the time, the founding board. And so he said, they really need you. They really need somebody that can do what you do.
Wow.
And he was very supportive of me always. And so he introduced me to Pontus and Richard, and I was the second employee retained. Uh, and so I worked on a wide variety of things. In the beginning, I was kind of doing everything
Hmm.
that was not operational management.
Hmm.
And I was working on two exhibits, one Automobile and Culture, which I worked with Ivan Chermayeff to design it. I put together the lenders. I went around the world getting to meet car collectors, which is sort of a nutty thing. And
Yeah.
these are the top car collectors, automotive collectors in the world. And they have very interesting lives, and I got to go in their very interesting cars because of course
Wow.
all want you to ride in their cars. And then so I organized many things like the book deal, the design of the exhibit, the traveling nature of it, all of that. And then I also worked on an exhibit that started out being called uh, Louis I. Kahn, Louis I. period Kahn,
Fun. Hmm.
architect.
Hmm.
And so on that, I was sent to Philadelphia to work with the successors to the Kahn practice,
Oh,
the
wow.
people who had been in his office, and I worked with his ex-wife. It was fascinating. It was fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
uh, I learned everything one could learn about Lucan. And
Yeah.
I just sad that because he came from a place very near, maybe a few miles from where my grandparents came from.
Hmm. Wow. Okay.
And so
Wow.
I had wish I had been able to meet him, but I could not.
Yeah. Saw a
And
documentary on him one time. Yeah, I saw some of his. It has sort of the what is it, the brutalist style or something like that. A lot of concrete.
yes,
Yeah, yeah. Love it.
yes,
Yeah. Hmm.
very much. And then I had later the privilege of working on the renovation of one of Kahn's first projects, the
Mm-hmm.
Yale University Art Gallery.
Okay.
So when I did work on that, I understood quite a bit about Kahn. And also Kahn's, my favorite building that Kahn ever designed was right near where I went to school in La Jolla, and it's the
Mm.
Salk Institute. And that is now it's kind of being Kahn's contribution is being diminished a
Mm.
bit. They're adding to the back again, but it still has components that are extraordinary, really
Mm.
extraordinary. And it's a combination of an amazing site, an amazing project, and an amazing design.
Mm.
And so I feel very privileged to have worked on that. And then at the same time, I worked on, so I'm doing all of this full time, and
Yeah.
I'm also doing full time the project management to create the site and the building for MoCA
Mm.
and the architect selection program, coordinating that, and the building program planning and doing that. And there are many intense stories about conflicts that happened in that period.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if you've read about it. And so
No, I haven't. No.
Calvin Tompkins did a great article for the New Yorker called "The Camel in the Tent." It's worth reading about. It's worth reading about. And so that was my first introduction to immersion in museum political issues.
Mm.
There were many arguments and so on. And so I learned a lot, and I spent 7.5 years on that. And I also worked on what it was originally called the Temporary Contemporary. Ivan Chermayeff named it. We were having lunch and talking about, well, what should we call this other building? Because the schedule for the main building, which was by Isazaki, was delayed because we had 3 different developers. They kept going up, belly up, and running out of money. So the actual opening schedule was greatly delayed, and our fundraising was suffering because we had nothing to show for it.
Mm.
And the opening day was delayed. So we created something called the Temporary Contemporary, which was supposed to be temporary, but is still in existence and now called the Geffen Contemporary. And that's separate from the building. That's about 1.5 miles away from the main museum building on Grand Avenue.
Is that Geffen? David Geffen? Is that
Yes,
the same?
the same, the very same. Yeah.
Okay. Lot of buildings named after him, I think, at this point, at this time, right?
A lot of buildings.
Yeah.
He's been very generous to culture and the
Yeah.
arts, especially
Yeah,
in New
very
York.
generous. Awesome.
The Philharmonic and Lincoln Center,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
now has the Geffen, and all over. He's been very, very generous.
Mm.
So when we finally opened the permanent building, the Isazaki building, then I had more phone calls to work on other projects. And I was still operating as a solo practitioner, kind of consultant, full-time for hire.
Was it what? It wasn't your own. Well, you were a solo practice, but you hadn't started Marcy Goodwin practice yet. Yeah. Okay. All right.
No, I worked as a contract employee.
Contract employee. Okay.
And then it didn't occur to me to start my own business because I didn't have any foresight about how any of this would occur. You know, I would get more phone calls, and so it seemed like, okay, I'll do this. Okay, I'll do this. But they just presented themselves. I didn't pursue anything.
Yeah.
And I was offered a position at the Getty when they were building the Richard Meyer building, but the culture at the time at the Getty was different than a culture. I'm a contemporary art person, and contemporary art people are very different they're more direct, as you said, they're more plain out there than antiquities and so on, and classical art. So I thought that my personal culture and the Getty culture at the time would not have worked out. And so then I worked on and off for 5 years on a project in San Jose, and it was very cute. I was the building project manager. I was the head of exhibits. I was sort of, again, asked to do everything. And for the tech in San Jose, the architect was Ricardo Legarreta. And I must say that it was a profound privilege to work with Ricardo. He was among the greatest people, not just architect, but people I've ever known. And He was, and I worked with him later on a project in Monterrey, Mexico called Marco, Marco. And it was so wonderful to work with him. And when I started the project at the Tech, it was meant to be about how all these startups came about in Silicon Valley.
Mm.
And I asked the mayor when I started, because I kind of worked indirectly for the redevelopment. I worked for the redevelopment agency directly and the mayor indirectly. And we were starting the Tech, in terms of all of its governance and how it operated. And I asked the mayor what he wanted out of the project. And he said, and mind you, this is like 1988 or so.
Mm.
He said, I want people to come to San Jose voluntarily.
That's so.
So I thought
Wow.
it was a good line because
Yeah.
at the time it was considered to be like Salt Lake City at the ocean. It
Okay.
was not,
No.
San Jose was not the place. Now
Mhm.
San Jose and Silicon Valley are the place.
Right.
But then I had to work with Steve Wozniak, Steve Jobs, all these
Wow.
tech people who were, I had thought they would be scientists, but they were entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
They were, and nearly everybody except for maybe Steve Jobs were into Dungeons and Dragons.
That's
So that
a
was,
big thing.
yeah.
I remember
If
that
you
was a
ever
big,
saw
yeah, big
that,
thing. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah, that TV show called Silicon Valley was a comedy on YouTube. I
I've
recommend
heard of it. I didn't watch it. Yes. Mhm.
I recommend it. It was an accurate depiction of what Silicon Valley was like at the time.
Oh,
And
wow. Wow.
and so then while I was doing that, I got another phone call from the director of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And he said they wanted to start up a project. They needed to select a site. They needed a program and so on. Was I willing to come up to San Francisco and work on this? And I thought, well, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And so that was about 4 years of working on that. While I was doing that, I worked on a brand new museum that was the Museum of the, it's a contemporary museum of Judaism.
Mm.
In this building, I had already done a feasibility study for separate purpose. And so they hired Daniel Libeskind
Hmm.
to do it. And so that is still going.
Okay.
And so that there, it's not far from where SF MoMA
Okay. Mhm.
relocated to. And then I worked and did the architect selection for the museum, and they chose Mario Botta,
Mm.
and many stories about that. And my favorite architect related story is that our major donor, Phyllis Haddis, Phyllis was a major fan of everything about contemporary art. And she was then about 84, 85,
Mm.
but she had all of her marbles. I went on a
Yeah.
tour with her around probably 10 museums around the country. And she was great. And it was very funny that the architects all talked about parti, Parti, which I knew what it meant.
Okay.
But they didn't realize that no one on the board knew what that was.
Mhm.
And so Phyllis, who was a little hard of hearing, said, Marcy, what are all these architects talking about? The party, the party. Are we going to have a party? I had to explain that when they talk about PARTI, they mean something different. Party.
Okay.
And so then I worked on that for several years. And then when it came time, we chose Mario Botta. It was an international search. And then I realized that there was a personal conflict between me and the real estate developer who was working as the building committee chair.
Mm.
He repeatedly told me he couldn't stand my voice. He couldn't stand hearing me talk. And he thought I was full of it.
Jeez.
Yeah, it was before the
Wow.
Me Too period.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so I chose to leave.
Mhm.
And then then I was offered a project for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago.
Mhm.
And I did a site selection program for that. And that was huge fun. And I did a program for the building. Of course, they got a new director after I had done all this, and he threw away the program and he chose to go in a completely different direction.
Hmm.
And although one of the funniest lines that I had from that period was I asked the staff strategically, what did they think was the most important thing about the future design of the museum? And they said, no lions. And I'm not from Chicago.
No. Oh, okay. All right.
And I
No, it's
said,
like
lions?
institute.
We're not going to have any lions. It's a contemporary art museum. No, what do you mean, no lions? And they said, Marcy, the Art Institute, it's got those lions in the
I
front,
love it.
those stairs. They wanted it to just be at grade,
Great.
at
Okay.
street level. And so sadly, they ended up getting a lot of stairs. No lions, but they got a lot.
But stairs.
And so I didn't work on that part. And then shortly after that, I was offered other jobs and other projects, a bunch of them. And I asked a friend who had gone independent. He was a mechanical and electrical engineer. And I
Mhm.
said, what should I do? I really, I'm wondering, like, what kind of career should I have? And
Mhm.
he said, do what I did. If you want to start your own, he said, you should start your own business. If you want to start your own business, here's what you do. You buy a fax machine. You get a bunch of business cards. You get a phone. That's your business phone. This is
Okay.
pre-cell phone.
Yeah.
And, and he said, and then you just go to meetings and stuff.
What
And and
advice,
I
huh?
and I thought that was such great advice. It was
Yeah.
kind of surreal, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
it
Yeah. I
it
guess that's all you really need, huh?
that's all you need. And now
Yeah.
you just have to
Yeah.
have your
Yeah.
cell phone and a website and so
Right.
on.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it it it's really not that hard. So originally I was M. Goodwin Associates,
Okay.
which was a shorter name, but then lots of people didn't understand what we did. They thought I
Okay.
might be like a doctor or a
Or a
lawyer or
lawyer or
something.
something. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so after many years of being that, then in 2013, I changed it to M. Goodwin Museum Planning. But
Okay.
during that period where I was MGA, worked on some really wonderful projects, really wonderful.
I guess a lot of your work from hearing your stories. And by the way, I just love, hearing all the stories. I said from the beginning, whenever I get a chance to talk with you, it's always a pleasure to hear you and hear some of the stories that you talk about. I mean, you've met Walt Disney, Steve Jobs. I mean, the list goes on and on of the experience, the wealth of experience that you have. So it is great to hear these stories. But yeah, continue on. Yeah, so you started MGMP, but most of your projects, I guess, came from word of mouth anyway, right? So it sort of passes on from the next
Yes,
person to the next. Yeah. Hmm.
yes. And so um, then I think what happened is that it's again a lot of the contacts that I made during that process of starting up as an independent, working as a contract employee, those just rolled into the next phase of work. And I was able during that next phase to work on the Harvard Art Museums, the North Carolina Museum of Art, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, the Blanton Museum at the University of Texas. The list is long, and I don't want to bore you with all of that.
Well, you've worked over 150, so it's probably a lot more than that by now. So, yeah.
It is, but there are some what I call significant institutions. And in many cases, we work several times on projects. So the Walker Art Center, which is probably one of the most important contemporary art museums in the world, not just the US, but in the world, worked on the Walker Art Center over a 25-year period, over all of the expansion studies, all of the expansion options. I was not part of selecting Herzog and Demeron as the architects, but I did a program which they implemented part of. And then it was just a lot of work. And also had to do the divorce, which was painful, between the Walker. In the beginning, they were like Siamese twins. The Walker and the Guthrie were next to each other. They shared a site that the Walker owned, but they shared a lobby, they shared an entry, and so on. And they were done by two different architects. Ed Barnes did the main Walker, and then another architect, Ralph Rapson, did the Guthrie. The Guthrie is a performing arts center.
Is that that has a long thrust? What is like a bridge or some type of cantilever? Is that?
Yes, their new version. After they got divorced, the new version was the French architect.
Jean Nouveau. How do you say it?
Jean Nouvel. Yeah. And turned out to be a very interesting building, very interesting site. But yes, it has that platform like a ski lift that comes out over the river.
Right.
And so the divorce, to me, I had never worked on a divorce between two institutions, and that was very emotional.
Wow.
But I learned a lot from it. But I was able to work with the Walker in all of these iterations. And then after Herzog and Demeron finished their major expansion, then the Walker called me back and said, we want to redo the Ed Barnes entry, and we want to make it essential that you would go through the Ed Barnes entry, and which I was in favor of completely. And so then because the entry where Herzog and Demeron put it faced this 8-lane highway road called Hennepin. And nobody parked there. Nobody came in that way. It was a, let's call it a procedural entry, not a physical entry. And they had made a parking structure in the hill behind, and that had no outlet into the Walker's main entry. So we re-strategized that about how to go from the parking to the entry of the Barnes entry, and then how to make that Barnes entry fun and a place where people would hang out and a place where people could meet friends, because most of the Walker's visitors first see the Minnesota Sculpture Garden, which is part of the Walker, where the Spoonbridge and Cherry, that famous Clay Oldenburg sculpture with the spoon and the cherry.
I'm not familiar with that one. I need to look that one up.
I'll have to send you a picture.
Yeah.
And so we redid the Barnes entry, which was my posthumous salute to Ed Barnes. And it was also, I think it's turned out really well. It's been very popular and has outdoor experiences, which you don't always think of that in a place like Minneapolis, but
Mhm.
they do want a lot of outdoor experiences.
Mhm.
So we did that. And it meant also redoing the hillside as a sculpture platform also,
Mhm.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
sloped sculpture platform.
Yeah. Awesome.
And
Well,
so,
I haven't asked you a lot of questions because I enjoy listening to
yes,
you, and you're actually hitting on a lot of uh things that I like to hear about.
I would say that 3/4 of it is wonderful and fun.
Okay.
And that of the wonderful and fun part, there's three aspects. Number one is the people that
Okay.
you get lifetime friends out of it. And because, I knew as a child, I would never be able to work like as a sales clerk. I never wanted to learn how to type because girls my age were expected to learn how to type and be secretaries or nurses. None of that I could
Right.
be.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and I could not do commercial things. And museums, the number one thing is that if you're thinking of museums and each type, art museums, science centers, history museums, transportation museums, and so on, museums of conscience, they're all nonprofits. They
Hmm.
all exist as 501c3s. Education is their primary mandate. The people who work in them believe this. It's like a religion. I joke
Mm.
sometimes that people who work in museums, they might have other peripheral religions, but they
Hmm.
have one primary religion, and that is they believe in education. They believe in doing things for the community. They believe that what they do is to improve mankind.
Mm.
Now, that's no small order, right? That's a
No,
big deal.
that's pretty.
It's a pretty big deal. And
Yeah.
so if you work in museums, for instance, this is a warning to architects. If you imagine architecture for museums is just building a place to hang art or building a room to stand in a lobby and look outside, no, it's not that. It is about this mission. And and all of these institutions tend to be nonprofits. And as a nonprofit, you have a different governance structure. So if for instance, you work with nonprofits and for profits, right?
Hmm. Right.
And sometimes you work for developers, right?
Right.
Sometimes when you work for nonprofits, how many clients are there for each project?
Um, how many clients?
Yeah,
Well, I would say if it's a nonprofit, it's for the community, right?
right. And so the governance is that they have a board or
Hmm.
they have a governmental structure or a governance structure that distributes decision making among multiple people.
Right.
If you work for a developer, and I've worked for several, quite a few, um, it's about them getting an idea, usually about making money.
Yeah. Profit.
And that is
Mhm.
the polar opposite of what most museum people are thinking of. They are thinking about inspiration, changing people's lives. They're
Right.
thinking about how to turn people on about different ideas. So when I say you get lifetime friends, you get to work with people like that. They're not going to be rich. They are, they believe in what they do. And so to me, that is one of the greatest rewards of what I do. And knowing that it makes a difference on society, that these projects, they're not like just doing a housing development. They change the community. And also I get to work with all kinds of architects, and many of them become lifetime friends.
Mm.
And that is a huge reward too, because to learn their worlds and how they see things is very cool. I
Yeah.
mean, I learned so much, and it is a thing in which together we work to make something huge
Mm.
and lasting that will last longer than our lifetimes. And I love that part.
Yeah, I guess it's mission driven and not necessarily money driven. Although you need the money to help it, but it's led by the mission at the forefront. One question I had, I have a segment in my discussion where I always say ask the experts. And
Yes.
so it's kind of a learning thing that I like to uh, discuss. I hear a lot of discussion about feasibility studies. I know that's a part of what you do. And I've worked on, as a cost consultant, worked on some feasibility studies as far as the putting the estimates for that particular building together. But my question is sort of explain what is the feasibility study for someone that doesn't understand your line of work. What is the feasibility study? And is there something that people tend to get wrong in the feasibility study that they're doing it wrong? This is how you should do a feasibility study to get the most out of it.
Yes, I thought about it. It's a very, very good question. And I thought about that a lot. As I mentioned earlier, it has to do, my answer has to do a lot with the fact of museum governance as a 501c3 and as an educational institution, and in having a board and so on, that it is not at all like a for-profit organization. It's not like IBM putting a new factory in, or Apple putting in a new Apple store.
Mhm.
That, as I mentioned earlier, the client is not a single person. It's a group, a
Mhm.
board, a committee.
Mhm.
Um, the information in the feasibility study is used for a variety of purposes that are not comparable to what is done in a for-profit feasibility study. In a
Mhm.
feasibility study for a housing development or an office tower, it's like, well, does it pencil out? You know, how much rent
Right.
are we going to put in there? How much are we going to sell each unit for? And then you look at the cost of building these, and maybe we make them smaller, maybe we make cheaper roofs or whatever.
Mhm.
Those are the alternates. In a museum, and especially an art museum, which depends to a great extent on revenue from programs and events inside it, plus revenue from donors and
Mhm.
and supportive entities. The feasibility study has multiple purposes. So it isn't just to determine the cost of the building. The feasibility study is used for instance, explaining what the project is to potential and existing donors. It's part of the pitch to say, okay, we've done our homework and here it is. And this is why it will cost this. And this is what we're describing doing. It's also that it is about, to the governance entity, if it's a museum nonprofit board, if it's a city entity or a state entity, it explains the project not just in terms of cost, but in terms of function and how those functions fit together. It's
Mhm.
also that it helps them in their decision making, whoever is the leader, so that they can say to themselves and to others that they have gone through the steps to check this out and to see what the issues are, because they might have to change some of the design concepts. It is also about what the museum's options are. And because the museum may have limited options,
Mhm.
a developer They can always walk, you know. I've seen several developers walk. They
Mm.
just say, well, that's a stupid idea. I'm not going to do that. And the museum, it's like having the Queen Mary or something to get them to make a decision. You're steering all these people and they have to work together. They have to understand all the criteria. And then it is also that the leadership team has a responsibility because the money they're using is usually not their own money.
Mm.
And as I mentioned, I've worked with lots of billionaires. I could
Yes.
write a book about billionaires.
Yes.
And it's donor money that they're using. And as that, because the donor money is often IRS tax deductible gifts, you have to be very careful because you're using someone else's money. And sometimes these are assigned tasks, like I'm giving you money for a drawing center or
Hmm.
a photography center or a children's play center, whatever it is, it has a dedicated allocation. And it means that the decision group has to be very careful with how they allocate the funds and what they approve. And so all of these are part of the story. And it is also that the architect sometimes hits the feasibility study and says, oh, well, I'm going to make a drawing that's going to knock their socks off. And it's going to be on architectural records front cover. And they're thinking of these things.
Hmm.
That isn't what the feasibility study is about for an art museum. It's a separate thing. Does that explain what
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It does. Yeah. Can you speak to that with the architect?
sometimes they do test fit drawings.
Okay, okay.
Sometimes they do a thing which shows design going
Hmm.
off
Hmm.
and very dramatic. And you've heard that Texas joke about somebody being all hat and no cows or
No,
something.
yeah, yeah, something, yeah, no cattle or something, yeah.
Yeah. And,
Or
and,
shows.
and for art museums, many architects tend to want to allocate more than 20%, maybe 40% in some cases, of the project budget to the roof to
Mm.
make a statement, a big statement.
Hmm.
And
Flash, yeah.
so the feasibility study can act as a warning to the client once you see how the budget works out in these different categories to say, do we really need that?
Hmm.
We did not do a feasibility study for the Milwaukee Art Museum, which was a very important project and it changed the nature of Milwaukee's self-identity,
Mm.
completely transformed it. But there was a choice and their actual fundraising had hit about 85, 95 million for the project. Santiago Calatrava was the architect.
Mm.
And Calatrava wanted, you're aware of what it looks like. It has those,
The exoskeleton,
yes,
probably.
that is a good word for
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Calatrava called it the bird.
Okay.
And he would say, I'm not just making the bird has to fly. So it cost 24 million to make the bird fly.
Wow. Was that
That
in
is,
the budget? Was that in the budget?
no, it was not in the budget. And they
Uh,
nearly went out of business because they didn't have that 24 million to make the bird fly.
oh, wow.
And they were also short by another 15 million or so in terms of the general building expansion and so on. So had we done a feasibility study, that would have been better because that we did not do a feasibility study to understand the net result of making the bird fly or making the bird sit still. And
Okay.
so that was a big deal.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was looking at the time. I didn't want to hold you too long, so I just had really one more question for you. Um, over the last few years, and I'd like to get your take on it. Over the last few years, I've been hearing the question posed, what is the future of museums? I've seen an article on it. I think someone wrote a article recently on it, but I'd like to get your take on it. What is the future of museums, as far as technology, whatever you see, whatever your thoughts are on it?
And again, I would say that it's very different for the type of museum we're talking about.
Hmm.
Art museums are very different from science centers, history centers, museums of conscience, and so on. Each has their own take on it because they have a different way of approaching their audiences.
Hmm.
So I would say, yes, there's more electronics. Some of us feel it's like the new cars that have all those information consoles that stick in the way of your
Right.
view of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
highway, and they all require digital interface that are like sitting there using your laptop as you're
Right.
driving.
Right.
And so there will definitely be more electronics. Definitely be, I think that while COVID hurt attendance for many museums in a tragic, dramatic way, it did offer new opportunities for remote learning, they call it.
Yeah.
And having online programming is an important aspect because it allows you to increase your visitation online, and then that encourages them to come there in person when they can. And it increases participation among the audience. Is there going to be more AI? Yeah,
Hmm.
I'm not in love with that, and I'm not saying that. My personal feeling is, all of those new things where you see living Van Gogh, immersive Van Gogh, and you go
Yeah.
and do Van Gogh. Lights. It makes me think of trip lights and stuff like that from my teen years. It is, because it's kind of psychedelic quality.
Yeah.
Um, but there will be more AI, and it may be in terms of collections access. It may be in terms of civic interaction. I don't know. It's an interesting thing. In the art world, we refer to bastardization of the art. We have to avoid bastardization of artworks, that the artist made something for a reason. We
Hmm.
can't just appropriate it and turn it into a trip light. And so there will be definitely more civic interaction, definitely more community interface, definitely buildings. When I started, art museums tended to have a collection. The collection was stored in a storage area. It had an exhibit that was separate, and then it had a changing exhibit that was separate, and then it maybe had a cafe, maybe, but usually not. Now the whole thing of interaction and encouraging visitors to come is a much bigger deal. And so it's also that more performance, because art has changed in the last 30, 40 years. The thing about contemporary art is that if you're talking art history, after World War II, and especially in the mid 1950s to 70s, they say art came off the pedestal.
Mm.
And so that's an important part of how you would experience a museum. Art is more immersive. I mean, think of Richard Serra's sculptures. They are, imagine putting them on a pedestal. That would be sort of ridiculous. So there will be more of that kind of interaction. And more art recently has been about performance and what they call performative art.
Right.
Some people like it, some people don't, but you have to allow spaces in the museum to experience that and to let the artist have the right kind of space. And also more artwork is using multimedia.
Mhm.
So there is that, there tend to be some galleries that are dedicated to having infrastructure that can support multimedia.
Mm.
And so I would say the idea of access to research collections is definitely expanding.
Hmm.
It used to require people to support it, and now they still need some people, especially at the core of the collection, but they can do it more electronically, including online. You could do it in your home, but it means scanning the collection and photographing the collection. And it means that design in art museums, design used to be separated between exhibit design and what we called 2D design, that
Mhm.
was doing brochures and mailers and stuff. It's no longer that. It is a combo pack of the education department, the design combo department, the PR and marketing department, um, and and the collections department and the curators all combined to talk about how they're reaching out to the community. That's a huge difference.
Mm.
That changes the nature of the spaces in the building.
Mm. Wow. Wow. I guess with the technology also, from the sounds of it, you'll need less human staff, I guess, with technology, less volunteers and paid staff, I would guess, or no.
You actually need more.
You need more now. Oh, wow. Okay.
Because some people have, you still have the people doing their core jobs. Then you have the people doing the digital interface.
Okay. Mhm.
And who are, but they're doing a combo pack of all the digital interfaces and all of the digital presence the museum has. It may be in the galleries. It may be that, you know, you can download your information from the labels, and of course those Q codes or whatever they're called.
Yeah, QR codes. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, that you click on, and somebody has to do all that.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Interesting. Interesting. Well, uh, last question is, what's next for you? Any new projects or speaking engagements, or what's next on the 2024 for you?
I think that
Yeah.
in 2025, I would like to go back to the conference where we first found each
Yeah.
other, to
Okay.
MAM, MAAM, Mid-Atlantic, what is it
Uh,
called? Mid-Atlantic, what's the other AM? Museum
uh,
Conference.
count me off guard. Association of
Mid-Atlantic
Museums.
Association of
Museums. Yeah,
Museums.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
just went to the one in Philadelphia. It was great.
Yeah, so I think for next year, I have some friends, we want to put together two different proposals. Um, I am going to talk at a couple other places around the US. I enjoy that, as you probably know.
Yeah.
I
And I
enjoy
enjoy
that,
it.
and it's fun. To me, it's fun to see people and to hear their responses and to
Mhm.
talk with them because they always have interesting views of things.
Mhm.
And sometimes it just goes in a totally different direction.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then I'm also going to work less.
Awesome. Great.
So Cameron is going to work more, Robert is going to work more, and I am going to work less. And I'm working
Well,
on my autobiography, which is 5 books.
I was going to ask you about that, or at least say you need to do a book because you have so many stories, and I could just listen to them all day. So I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that, and I have been, and it's going to be very visual and have images and artifacts and stuff. And
Yeah.
so I've been collecting them for the last 15 years to do this. now I'm ready. And I just have to organize it and start putting it
Yeah.
together. The stories are quite wonderful, and
Yeah.
in some cases, amazing, just
Yeah.
amazing.
Well, I have to get my autographed copy of that whenever it comes out. I definitely want to get a copy of that. That is going to be great.
Yes.
Well, it's great having you, and I'm so glad I was able to talk with you. I wish you had more time. I really need to do a follow up with you to hear some more stories. You have so many, so many. You blew me away with the Steve Jobs and the Walt Disney. Like, wow, okay, great.
Yeah, and
It-
and later I was able to work on the Walt Disney Museum. There's
okay.
a wonderful Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, which the story of why it's there in San Francisco is a whole separate story. I won't go into
Mhm.
that here. But I got to work with Walt's daughter and his grandchildren
Mhm.
and help set up the museum so that it would have success. It's actually a very interesting project and it turned out great. And David, the theater designer in San Francisco, what's his name? He did a lot of the exhibits and he did a great job.
The Applebaum,
No, that's Ralph Applebaum.
Ralph Applebaum. Excuse me.
Yeah. What's his last name? I think starts with the F. I'm going to have to tell you later. And so he does a lot of
Is that Rockwell? No,
yes,
Rockwell. Okay, yeah, all right,
yes.
Rockwell. Hmm.
And he did an amazing job on it. And that's a hard thing to do. And he did it tastefully and thoughtfully.
Hmm.
And it was because the question is so many stories with Walt Disney, and which ones do you follow?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. It can last all day, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, I definitely enjoyed this talk. I guess the best way to get in contact with you, if someone wanted to get in touch with you, is it your website information?
Yeah, when we're redoing our website right now, so it's a slightly dysfunctional website today. But definitely the website
Okay.
and www.mgmp.us.
Yeah. I'll put that in the description down below. So, Marcy, thank you. I can't thank you enough. Enjoyed speaking with you and hope to talk with you in the near future on other things. So I appreciate it and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes,
And
thank
talk
you.
with you. Talk with you soon.
Thank you. It's been delightful seeing you. Thank you and talking with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.